Liviano Pagnotto had never shown weakness to a single soul in the underworld. But looking down at the pool of dark crimson spreading across the rain-drenched asphalt, the ruthless Don dropped to his knees, his white shirt soaking through with freezing water and his secretary's blood. The demand that tore from his throat in that moment would strike terror into the heart of every cartel on the continent. If you love stories where loyalty, danger, and unexpected love collide, subscribe and join us for this one. And stay until the end, because Pamela's story is only beginning, and the woman everyone underestimated may become the most powerful person in the entire empire. To the outside world, Pamela Howard was just a shy, unassuming secretary. Soft, full-figured, and framed by dark curls, she was a quiet sanctuary in a world built on gunsmoke and betrayal. She kept her head down, managed Liviano's complex enterprises with silent perfection, and remained untouched by the bloodshed around her. For 4 years, Liviano harbored a consuming, protective obsession with her, keeping his distance so his shadow would never stain her innocence. That restraint ended under the flashing neon lights of the boulevard. As Pamela crossed the street clutching a black leather briefcase, a rival armored vehicle accelerated directly into her path, sending her broken body flying onto the wet concrete. The high-rise headquarters of Pagnotto Enterprises smelled of polished mahogany, old money, and the faint, coppery tang of suppressed violence. To the city of Chicago, Liviano Pagnotto was an untouchable titan of industry. But behind the reinforced blast doors of the 42nd floor, he was the uncontested dawn of an empire built on terror and iron will. Men twice his age broke into cold sweats beneath his dark, piercing gaze. A single tap of his inked fingers against a conference table could order an execution, collapse a rival enterprise, or buy off a city precinct before midnight. Yet the only sound capable of piercing through the dark hum of his brutal world was the soft click of low heels against the parquet floor. Pamela Howard entered his inner office with the quiet grace that made Liviano's chest tighten every single day. She was not the kind of woman who belonged in the blood-stained corridors of the outfit. While the women circling Liviano's world were razor-thin, venomous socialites dressed in sharp, predatory cuts, Pamela was soft. She was lush, carrying generous, feminine curves that filled out her modest dark skirts and emerald blouses. Her thick curls were always pinned back in a neat, shy twist, framing large, warm eyes that invariably looked down whenever Liviano walked past. She was timid, easily startled by the loud voices of his capos, and never spoke unless spoken to. But she was the beating heart of his entire syndicate. "Your 3 o'clock with the dock authority was rescheduled to Friday, Mr. Pagnotto," Pamela murmured, setting a porcelain cup of espresso on his desk with trembling precision. Her voice was a gentle whisper, devoid of the harsh bite that characterized every other voice in his life. "And the offshore transfer receipts for the shipping ports are filed in the black leather briefcase, as requested." Liviano leaned back in his leather armchair, the tattoos coiling up his forearms, shifting under the sleeves of his rolled-up white shirt. His dark eyes tracked her every movement, with an intense, possessive hunger that bordered on psychotic. For 4 years, she had been his secretary. For 4 years, she had organized his multi-million-dollar illicit ledgers, kept his black market accounts bulletproof, and managed the chaotic pulse of his empire without a single complaint. He knew she feared him. Everyone did. But what terrified Liviano far more was the all-consuming, depraved devotion he felt toward her. He kept his distance, burying his violent nature beneath a mask of cold professionalism, because he knew the moment he gave in, the darkness of his world would swallow her whole. She was his only sanctuary, the single pure, untouched thing in his corrupted reality. "Thank you, Pamela," Liviano said, his deep, gravelly voice softening to a register reserved exclusively for her. She offered a faint, shy smile, her cheeks blooming with a subtle blush, before she bowed her head and stepped back toward her desk outside the double doors. Liviano watched her retreat, his jaw clenching as he inhaled the lingering scent of sweet vanilla and fresh paper she left behind. He would tear down the entire city before he ever allowed a single drop of this world's blood to touch her. The sky over the Chicago boulevard opened up in a violent, freezing deluge, turning the gleaming asphalt into a dark mirror reflecting the city's neon lights. Liviano stepped out through the towering glass doors of the Pagnotto Tower, his heavy wool overcoat draped across his shoulders. Flanked by 4 of his deadliest capos in dark, tailored suits, his sharp eyes scanned the street. He had told Pamela to wait for him. The harbor negotiations had run dangerously late, and the reckless, creeping encroaching of Enzo Moretti's crew in recent weeks left a bitter taste of impending violence in the air. He saw her across the wide boulevard, clutching the black leather briefcase against her chest like a shield. She was dressed in an emerald green dress that hugged her soft curves, her dark curls damp from the misting wind. She looked fragile beneath the towering skyscrapers, waiting patiently for the signal to cross. Then the violent roar of a supercharged engine shattered the rhythm of the falling rain. From around the blind intersection, a heavy, armored black SUV tore through the red light. It did not skid. It did not slow. The high beams locked onto the sidewalk with lethal, unmistakable intention, surging straight toward the curb where Pamela stood. Pamela! A feral, guttural roar ripped from Liviano's chest. The icy composure that had ruled the underworld for a decade vanished in a heartbeat. He lunged forward into the street, his leather shoes skidding against the slick, flooded road, his capos drawing their weapons behind him in instant alarm. He was 20 yards away when the sickening impact echoed across the boulevard. The heavy metal bumper struck Pamela, sending her body flying through the air before she crashed violently onto the rain-drenched pavement. The black briefcase tore open upon hitting the ground, scattering encrypted port ledgers and blood-stained papers across the flooded street. The armored vehicle never braked. Its tires shrieked as it corrected course and vanished into the stormy night, leaving the faint emblem of Moretti's crew burned into Liviano's retinas. Liviano reached her before the tail lights had even disappeared. He collapsed to his knees, not caring as the freezing puddle soaked through his trousers and shirt. His tattooed hands trembled uncontrollably as he hovered over her. Pamela lay pale and broken, crimson blood pooling rapidly beneath her head, mixing with the torrential rain and staining the emerald fabric of her dress. "Look at me, Pamela! Look at me!" Liviano choked out, his voice cracking with a raw, terrifying panic that none of his men had ever heard before. He gently cupped her bloodied face, his inked fingers stained dark with her blood, pressing his other hand over the deep gash across her ribs. "Stay with me. Don't you dare close your eyes." Behind them, his capos moved with lethal precision. Guns drawn, they formed an impenetrable iron wall around the perimeter, blocking off the street as the city fell into a terrified silence. The Don of Chicago was on his knees in the gutter, holding the shattered body of the only woman he loved, and the storm brewing in his eyes promised to burn the entire world to ash. The 4th-floor trauma wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital became a militarized zone within 15 minutes of their arrival. 60 heavily armed men from the Pagnotto Syndicate seized every entrance, fire escape, and elevator bay. Hospital security had stepped aside without a word, terrified by the sheer volume of suppressed weapons and dead-eyed soldiers flooding the corridors. Surgeons and trauma nurses moved with frantic, trembling precision under the suffocating silence of an underworld occupation. At the epicenter of the lockdown stood Liviano Pagnotto. He had refused to wash. His white dress shirt was ruined, soaked through with Pamela's dark crimson blood that was now drying into stiff, rusty armor across his chest and arms. His tattooed knuckles were stained red, his hair unkempt and damp from the storm. He paced the sterile white corridor outside the operating theater like a starving wolf pacing the perimeter of a cage. The sharp scent of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol made him violently sick. It smelled of mortality, of the frail thread currently keeping the shy woman who held his soul tethered to the living. The heavy doors at the end of the hall swung open. Marco, his second in command, approached with guarded steps, keeping his hands visible and his voice low. The SUV was dumped in a chop shop off Cicero Avenue, Marco reported, his gaze shifting nervously away from the dried blood on his Don's chest. Stripped and set on fire. But our surveillance from the south side spotted the staging crew. It's Enzo Moretti. He's holed up in his riverfront estate, thinking he just severed your logistical spine by taking out your secretary. Liviano stopped pacing. When he turned to face Marco, the underboss involuntarily took a step back. There was no fury in the Don's eyes. There was only a cold, hollow abyss that promised total extinction. "Lock this city down," Liviano commanded. His voice was not loud, but it carried a deadly weight that seemed to drop the temperature in the entire wing. "I want every port, every rail yard, and every bridge monitored by our crews. Not a single crate moves in Chicago until I say so." "Don Liviano," Marco stammered, his throat dry. "If we choke the supply lines, the commission in New York will step in. The federal task force will bring down the entire syndicate. We could lose 50 million by sunrise. Do you think I give a damn about the money?" Liviano snarled, closing the distance in an instant, grabbing Marco by the collar of his suit jacket and shoving him against the concrete wall. The raw malice in his eyes pinned the underboss to the spot. "Moretti ran his car into the only thing in this rotting world that matters to me. I want his warehouses burned to the dirt. I want his distributors dragged into the streets. I want everyone who shares his bloodline hunting for a place to hide." Liviano released him, stepping back with his jaw clenched tight. "Tell the capos this isn't business anymore. It's an eradication. Nobody sleeps until Moretti is begging on his knees." The intensive care unit was silent, save for the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the heart monitor. Outside the heavy double doors, a dozen armed enforcers stood guard. But inside, the terrifying Don of Chicago sat motionless on a low plastic chair. Liviano had pulled his chair tight against the bed, his head bowed, his calloused, tattooed fingers cradling Pamela's pale, limp hand with desperate reverence. Her soft, curvaceous frame was swallowed by the stiff hospital sheets. Deep purple bruises bloomed across her collarbone, and white bandages bound her fractured ribs. But the steady rise and fall of her chest was the only anchor keeping Liviano from losing his mind completely. A quiet, raspy intake of breath broke the sterile stillness. Liviano's head snapped up. Pamela's thick eyelashes fluttered, parting slowly against the dim ambient light. Her dark eyes were clouded with the haze of heavy narcotics, but as they drifted down to their intertwined hands, a faint spark of awareness returned. "Mr. Pagnotto," she whispered, her voice dry and barely audible above the hum of the machines. "Don't move, anima mia," Liviano said softly, his gravelly voice thick with raw emotion. He stood immediately, leaning over the bed, his large hand trembling, as he gently brushed a dark curl away from her forehead. "You're safe. You're in the private wing. The surgeons fixed the internal bleeding." Pamela winced as a shallow breath pulled at her bruised ribs, her gaze dropping to the stiff, rust-colored stains covering his dress shirt. "Your shirt? Is that?" "It doesn't matter," he interrupted gently, his thumb caressing the soft curve of her cheek. "All that matters is you're alive. Moretti will pay for every drop. I've already ordered his entire operation wiped off the map." A flicker of distress cut through the drug-induced fog in Pamela's eyes. Despite her frail state, her hand tightened against his with surprising strength. "No, Mr. Pagnotto. Wait. You can't just burn his warehouses." Liviano frowned, caught off guard by the sudden resolve in her soft voice. "Pamela, he tried to take your life. He thought he could break me through you. He wanted you to react blindly," she murmured, struggling through the pain to keep her thoughts linear. The shy, easily startled secretary was giving way to the brilliant mind that had silently managed his empire for 4 years. "Before the bumper hit me, I saw the plates. It wasn't a standard hit team. The registration was 7 Alpha Sierra 94, a private lease registered to Moretti's Shell Corporation in Gary." Liviano went completely still, staring at her in disbelief. "And the black briefcase," Pamela continued, her breathing shallow but steady. "I had already cross-referenced his illicit shipping manifests yesterday. Moretti didn't just target me to hurt you. He is moving a massive unregistered weapons shipment through Pier 17 tomorrow at midnight to fund his coup. He needed your attention divided by a gang war." She looked up into Liviano's dark, stunned eyes, a fragile yet razor-sharp conviction settling over her features. "Don't waste your men on his empty warehouses," she whispered. "Take Pier 17. Take his shipment. Strip him of his money, and he has nowhere left to run." If you're already rooting for Pamela, let me know in the comments. She may have been the quietest person in Liviano's world, but sometimes the person standing quietly in the background is the one seeing everything. Subscribe and stay with us, because her biggest move is still coming. By midnight, the city of Chicago became a cage with no exits. Armed with the Shell Corporation records and license plate details Pamela had pulled from her photographic memory, Liviano unleashed his syndicate with surgical, terrifying precision. There were no chaotic street brawls or reckless firebombings. Instead, Liviano executed a calculated chokehold on Enzo Moretti's empire, dismantling the rival Don's infrastructure block by block. In an industrial park outside Gary, Indiana, 3 armored Suburbans carrying Liviano's top-hit crews breached the gates of Moretti's primary logistics front. Sledgehammers took down the reinforced security doors in seconds. Inside, Moretti's money counters and lieutenants were caught completely off guard, surrounded before a single alarm could be triggered. The offshore ledgers, hard drives, and encrypted satellite phones containing Moretti's overseas accounts were seized, while every vehicle bearing the Shell fleet's registration was impounded. Simultaneously, across the South Side freight corridors, Marco led 3 separate raid teams to intercept Moretti's covert supply convoys. Semi-trucks, loaded with contraband and untraceable cash, were hijacked at gunpoint, their drivers subdued, and their cargo rerouted straight into Pagnotto-controlled warehouses. Every covert distribution node Pamela had flagged in her mental catalog was raided, stripped clean, and padlocked before local law enforcement even received a call. By 3 in the morning, Liviano stood in the center of a soundproofed freight depot on the edge of the river, watching his men unload stacks of seized bearer bonds and weapons crates. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and rain. He casually wiped the soot from his hands with a cloth, listening as Marco read out the incoming reports from across the territory. "Every front company in Illinois and Indiana is dark," Marco said, a look of genuine awe crossing his scarred face. "We seized $8 million in liquid assets, intercepted 3 major weapons convoys, and locked his offshore accounts through the Cayman routing codes Pamela gave us. Moretti doesn't have enough cash left to pay his personal security detail, let alone buy off the commission." Liviano tossed the rag aside, his expression cold and unyielding. The fury that had threatened to tear him apart at the hospital was now channeled into pure, lethal focus. Pamela had handed him the blueprint to Moretti's complete ruin, turning what should have been a bloody, drawn-out gang war into an absolute execution of power. "He's isolated," Liviano said, his deep voice slicing through the cold hum of the warehouse. "He has no money, no shipments, and no allies left in the 5 families. The only thing he has left is tomorrow night at Pier 17. "Do we strike his private estate now, boss?" Marco asked, resting a hand on his holstered firearm. "No," Liviano replied, his dark eyes narrowing with predatory calculation. "Let him realize he's bleeding out first. Let him panic when he finds out his entire foundation was erased by the very woman he tried to kill." He turned toward his private car, his mind already drifting back to the fortified bedroom where Pamela was resting under heavy guard. "Prep the convoy for Pier 17. We finish this on our terms." The private suite of Liviano's sprawling lakeside estate was fortress quiet. Heavily armed guards patrolled the iron gates and perimeter walls, but inside the master bedroom, the only light came from the warm, amber glow of the hearth. Pamela sat propped against a mountain of dark silk pillows on the massive king-sized bed. She was swimming in one of Liviano's crisp, oversized black button-downs, the stark linen draping over her lush curves and bruised collarbone. Her dark curls fell loosely around her shoulders. A tablet rested against her thighs, glowing with the encrypted shipping logs for Pier 17. The heavy oak doors clicked open, and Liviano stepped inside. He had finally changed out of his blood-stained clothes into a clean charcoal shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink swirling over his forearms. The lethal, untouchable Don who commanded the city with an iron fist seemed to evaporate the moment his eyes locked onto her. He crossed the hardwood floor with silent strides, reached down, and gently lifted the tablet from her lap, setting it on the nightstand. "You are supposed to be sleeping, Pamela," he scolded in a low, gravelly rasp, sinking onto the edge of the mattress. "I was verifying the customs manifests for Moretti's dock," she whispered, her cheeks flushing a delicate rose beneath her pale skin. Her voice was small, but her warm eyes held his. If the shipment isn't intercepted properly, he could slip through the Coast Guard's net. "Let Marco handle the manifests," Liviano said softly. His large, scarred hand hovered near her face before his calloused fingers lightly grazed the curve of her jaw. His touch was reverent, impossibly gentle for a man whose hands were built for violence. "You almost died on that asphalt, Pamela, because of me." "It was Moretti, Mr. Pagnotto, not Liviano," he cut in, his voice dropping to a harsh, aching whisper. "Call me Liviano." Pamela's breath hitched, her fingers tightening in the silk sheets. For 4 years, a wall of strict professionalism had kept them apart, a shield she had hid behind, convinced a man like him could never look at someone like her with anything more than tolerance. "I built a cage around myself to keep from touching you," Liviano murmured, leaning closer until his shadow enveloped her, the faint sense of cedar and smoke filling the air between them. His dark eyes burned with an unhinged, possessive intensity. "Every day you walked into my office, with your quiet grace and your soft smiles, you brought me to my knees. I kept my distance, because I thought my world would destroy you. But seeing you broken in that street, I realized I would burn the entire earth to ash before I let anyone take you from me." Pamela looked up into the fierce, unguarded abyss of his expression. The fear she usually felt around powerful men was entirely absent. In its place was a fierce, answering warmth. Slowly, wincing slightly as the motion pulled at her ribs, she lifted a trembling hand and pressed her palm against his rough cheek. "I was never afraid of your darkness, Liviano," she whispered back. With a ragged groan, Liviano closed the remaining distance, his lips meeting hers in a deep, desperate, possessive claim that shattered the last remnant of who they used to be. The morning sun did nothing to pierce the cold, gray mist hanging over the Chicago River. Inside his fortified riverfront mansion, Enzo Moretti was coming unglued. The sudden, calculated evisceration of his empire over the last 24 hours was impossible. His bank accounts were frozen, his distribution hubs were smoldering ruins, and the 5 families in New York had gone dead silent, abandoning him to the wolves. He had meant to cripple Liviano Pagnotto by crushing his logistical center. Instead, he had awakened a monster. Desperation drove Moretti to the only card he had left. Standing in the damp chill of Pier 17's private hangar, Moretti adjusted his trench coat, his hand twitching against the encrypted radio in his pocket. Beside him, 2 of his surviving enforcers dragged a battered, bound figure into the center of the loading bay. Antonio Russo, one of Liviano's oldest harbor capos, captured during the Dawn raid. Moretti dialed Liviano's direct, secure line. The call connected on the first ring. "Pagnotto," Moretti spat, his voice strained with frantic bravado over the sound of the churning tide. "You think you've won because you raided a few warehouses? I have your harbor capo on his knees at Pier 17. You come here alone to negotiate his release and return my seized assets, or I paint the concrete with his brains and send him to you in pieces." There was a chilling, absolute silence on the other end of the line before Liviano spoke, his tone completely flat. "Pier 17, midnight. If a single hair is out of place on Russo, I will ensure your death takes 3 days. The line went dead. A cruel, feral grin spread across Moretti's pale face. He lowered the phone and turned toward the shadowy recesses of the cavernous warehouse. "Wire the pylons," Moretti commanded his head demolitions mercenary, pointing toward the heavy timber and steel foundations beneath the pier floor. "Line the entire central bay with military-grade C4. Wire the detonator to a dual-frequency relay on my private receiver." Moretti never intended to negotiate. He knew he couldn't beat Pagnotto in an open war now that his financial spine was severed. This wasn't an exchange, it was an extermination. The moment Liviano stepped onto the dock to retrieve his capo, Moretti planned to trigger the charges from the safety of an offshore speedboat, collapsing the entire pier into the freezing black depths of Lake Michigan, drowning Pagnotto and his top crew in a single, fiery blast. "Make sure the trigger is hidden," Moretti muttered, watching the red indicator lights blink to life along the explosive charges beneath the floorboards. "The Don thinks he's coming to collect a debt. He's walking straight into his grave." Midnight fog rolled over the black waters of Lake Michigan, shrouding Pier 17 in a freezing, suffocating haze. The heavy timbers of the loading dock groaned beneath the rhythm of the crashing tide, but the vast cargo terminal was deathly quiet. Enzo Moretti stood 50 yards down the pier, flanked by his remaining gunmen, with the beaten form of Antonio Russo kneeling on the wet planks between them. In the dark pocket of his coat, Moretti's fingers gripped the heavy metal detonator, waiting for the exact moment the trap would spring. The twin halogen beams of 3 armored Pagnotto SUVs sliced through the mist, their engines a low, rumbling growl as they rolled onto the concrete apron and stopped. The heavy doors opened. Liviano Pagnotto stepped into the damp night air, flanked by Marco and half a dozen silent enforcers with suppressed rifles lowered. Liviano wore a long, black, tailored coat, his inked hands tucked casually into his pockets, his posture relaxed, despite the crosshairs aimed at his chest. "You're late, Pagnotto," Moretti shouted, his voice cracking with manic edge against the roaring wind. "Step forward alone. Hand over the encrypted ledger codes for my offshore funds, or Russo's brains join the lake." Liviano did not rush. He took 3 measured steps forward, the heels of his leather shoes clicking sharply on the damp deck. His dark eyes locked onto Moretti with a cold, predatory detachment that made the rival Don's stomach churn. "You never intended to negotiate, Enzo," Liviano said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the dock. "You wired half a ton of military-grade C4 along the eastern pylons 40 minutes ago." Moretti froze, the blood draining from his face before a jagged, hysterical laugh broke from his throat. "Then you know you're already dead. One click of this transmitter, and this entire pier drops into the freezing dark. You, your men, your empire, gone." Moretti raised the small black detonator into the air and slammed his thumb down on the red trigger. Nothing happened. The silence on the dock was absolute. Moretti jammed the switch again and again, his breath coming in wild, panicked gasps as he stared in horror at the dark, lifeless LED on the unit. "Pamela cross-referenced your demolition supplier 3 hours ago," Liviano said smoothly, stepping closer until the sheer menace radiating off him filled the space between them. "She flagged your secondary relay frequencies before your men even finished setting the charges. My technicians jammed your signal 30 seconds before we drove through the gate." Behind Liviano, Marco and his snipers fired in synchronized, muffled bursts. Moretti's remaining bodyguards crumpled to the wooden deck before they could raise their weapons, leaving the rival Don alone, shivering and weaponless under the dim harbor lights. Liviano closed the final distance, grabbing Moretti by the throat with a grip of solid iron, lifting him off his feet and dragging him to the pier's edge. Moretti gasped, clawing desperately at the tattooed hands choking the life from him. "You should have kept your hands to yourself, Enzo," Liviano whispered into his ear, his voice a lethal promise. "You struck the only thing on this earth I live for." A single muffled shot echoed into the fog. Liviano released his grip, watching with cold indifference as Enzo Moretti's lifeless body plunged into the icy black waters below, sinking without a trace. The heavy wrought-iron gates of the Pagnotto estate swung open as the armored convoy rolled up the long, winding drive. The dawn mist was just beginning to burn away over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in soft shades of pale gold and lavender. The violence of Pier 17 felt a world away, washed clean by the morning tide. Liviano stepped out of the vehicle, shedding his heavy overcoat into Marco's waiting hands. He didn't linger in the grand foyer to discuss territory consolidations or the inevitable absorption of the Moretti syndicates. Instead, he took the sweeping marble staircase 2 steps at a time, moving with an urgency he had never shown for any illicit billion-dollar deal. He pushed the heavy double doors of the master suite open. Pamela was awake, sitting near the bay window wrapped in a thick, emerald cashmere robe that matched the green of her eyes. The dark bruises along her collarbone were beginning to fade, and the pale fragility that had haunted her in the hospital was replaced by a soft, glowing warmth. When she saw him standing in the doorway, unharmed, towering, and whole, a slow, breathtaking smile broke across her face. Liviano crossed the room in seconds, sinking to his knees before her armchair. Without a word, he gathered her gently into his arms, burying his face in the soft crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet, grounding scent of vanilla that had anchored his soul for 4 long years. Pamela let out a soft sigh, her warm fingers tangling into his dark hair, cradling him against her with a steady, quiet strength. "It's over," Liviano murmured against her skin, his voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. "Moretti is gone. His empire is dissolved. No one will ever threaten you again, Mia Regina." "I know," Pamela whispered, pressing a tender kiss to the top of his head. "I never doubted you for a second, Liviano." Liviano pulled back slightly, his dark, tattooed hands coming up to frame her soft cheeks. His gaze was fierce, possessive, and completely devoted. He reached into his pocket and produced a heavy platinum signet ring, bearing the crest of the Pagnotto bloodline, sliding it smoothly onto her finger. It was the mark of absolute authority, the ring that commanded the loyalty of thousands of soldiers across the eastern seaboard. "You spent 4 years hiding in the shadows of my office, keeping this entire city running while I pretended you were just my secretary," Liviano said, his gravelly voice dropping to an intimate vow. "No more hiding. You dismantled a syndicate from a hospital bed with nothing but your mind. You are not my subordinate, Pamela. You are the beating heart of this empire. From this day forward, what you command is law. Where I rule, you reign beside me. If you stayed with Liviano and Pamela all the way to this moment, welcome to the family." Tell me in the comments whether Pamela deserved that ring, and subscribe if you want more stories filled with loyalty, danger, and unexpected love. Pamela looked down at the ring, then back up into the dark eyes of the man who had brought a city to its knees for her. The timid girl who once looked at the floor was gone, replaced by a woman who knew the fierce power of her own mind and the untouchable protection of the Don who loved her. Leaning down, she pressed her lips to his, sealing their reign in the quiet light of the morning.